Hello young learner teachers! If you'd like to start planning story-based lessons, this involves much more than reading the book itself. So whether you're teaching remotely or you're in the classroom with your students, there are lesson stages that you need to include in any good story-based lesson. So in this video, I'm going to share with you the lesson plan framework that I use so that you can try it out in your context. But more importantly, I want you to understand my process so that you can plan your own story-based lessons with any paper-based book or online animated story. Make sure you keep watching to find out how you can also download my free story-based lesson plan. So here we go. When planning a lesson around a book, I like to start by thinking about the key concepts that are in the story. Here's an example. I've planned a lesson around an original animated story from the Book a Class app. It's called At the Market. Now, buying food from street markets is a fairly common thing here in Brazil, where I live. So this will be a familiar context for my 4-year-old learners and a great way to introduce and practice a range of vocabulary for fruit and vegetables and structures for making polite requests. Now, this story also works as a jump-off point for dramatic play activities, allowing the children to use language from the story to role-play buying and selling fresh produce in our classroom market. Doesn't this already sound like a fun lesson? The next step for me is defining clear learning outcomes. This will help me make better choices about the planned activities I'm going to include, and it also gives me clarity about what to look for when I assess how successful the lesson was. So in this lesson, children, I hope, will develop not just vocabulary for food and structures for polite requests, but also some important life skills. Then I think about the key language that I'm going to need to introduce or revise prior to reading that's going to support their understanding of the story or help them in the activity that they're going to do afterwards. Do you think they need to understand every word in order to follow the story? Not at all. In fact, I've found that children are incredibly good at interpreting meaning when the language is presented in context. Of course, I have to make sure that I've done a good job at the following. The first thing is selecting a story that has an appropriate level of challenge and concepts which are age appropriate. I also want to make sure that I've prepared a pre-reading stage that's going to provide useful input. And then finally, I want to be mindful to plan how I'm going to use images and gestures and even my voice during the story to help support their understanding. So there are many ways that you might like to structure your story-based lesson. Here's mine. I feel that this is a really easy framework to adapt to your own teaching context. Now, I know that a lot of teachers love ready-made lesson plans. In fact, you can download mine with a link that I'm going to leave in the description. However, we can't rely on lesson plans that other people wrote for us. You can and you must be able to adapt lesson plans or plan your own lessons. However, if you're new to this, you might find mine a very useful structure that you can begin with. So the first stage is really to introduce key language. And as I mentioned earlier, you don't need to pre-teach every word before reading a story. In fact, that's a terrible idea. However, there may be key language that's worth introducing or revising in order to prepare them for listening to the story. And there are lots of ways that you can do this. But in the lesson plan that I wrote for you, I've used the famous mystery box, or in this case, it's going to be mystery supermarket bags. These can work perfectly to spark curiosity and introduce vocabulary or a concept that they're going to hear in the story. If you're teaching online as well, you can still do the same thing and introduce or slowly reveal key objects from around the edges of your screen. So let's talk about the next stage. It's the pre-reading stage. What I want you to do is, first of all, make sure you sit where you can be easily seen and heard. All of the children need to be facing the book. So if you're in a classroom with a group of children, make sure that they're in rows and not in a circle for story time. If you're online, make sure that you're sitting close enough to the camera while still able to show your facial expressions and gestures as well as the book. Set them up for success by developing a routine that is going to indicate to them that it's story time. Listening to a book being read aloud in a foreign language requires a lot of attention and focus, and we can help children with this by teaching them specific strategies such as whole body listening. It's really important that you provide support. Encourage students to draw on their current linguistic or world knowledge. Look at the cover. Brainstorm words and ideas based on the title and the images. Use the images from the story and have students predict what the story is going to be about. If you've read the book before, you might encourage your students to recall as much as they can about the characters or the storyline. And show enthusiasm for the book. If you don't get excited about it, your students won't either. So next up is the wild reading stage, and I want to give you a few general guidelines about reading aloud. Always read the story to yourself before going public. You need to decide how you'll read it, what voices and actions you'll use. You need to get a feel for the rhythm and the speed, and you need to use plenty of facial expressions, gestures, and make use of the images to help support their understanding of the text. Never use this moment to test them on their vocabulary with questions like, what's this and what's this? Instead, plan ways that you'll encourage participation with gestures and questions that help them reflect or predict. Now, I don't want to suggest that you're not going to use a story to test their understanding of vocabulary or structures or concepts. I just believe that this should happen in a separate lesson stage. Your post-reading activities. Have a circle time, sit down, open up that book again, look more explicitly at the vocabulary. Have a discussion about what happened in the story and why. You can do all of this after the story's been read. Then, in this lesson or in a future lesson, you can actually use the story as a jump-off point for lots of different wonderful activities that are going to help extend their understanding of what happened in the story and give them an opportunity to use that language in new, original ways. For this particular story, I think it would be really nice to do a role play using different realia, different objects from a market, and have them role play that language and those roles of buyer and seller. But you can think of lots of different things that you might like to do after reading a story. So that's my lesson plan framework for story-based lessons. I know that teaching children can be challenging, but with support and training, it can be one of the most fulfilling jobs in the world. My mission is to transform the way English is taught to children. And to do that, I'm building a community of teachers like you and offering meaningful training that helps them find professional and financial fulfillment in their careers. You might like to join me in a growing number of teachers on Instagram, where you're going to find more support, free content and courses for the young learner teacher. Or you might like to read the blog post that I wrote and sign up to get the free lesson plan that I'm really happy to share with you as well. I've also linked to the Book a Class app for partners of mine. Try it out for 14 days for free and use my free lesson plan with their story at the market, or write your own for any of the animated songs and stories that they have there. There's literally hundreds. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you online soon.